Senhoras e senhores, neste momento estamos dando início à sessão solene que irá culminar com a aula magna que será proferida pelo nosso ilustre convidado, o presidente Bill Clinton. Estão compondo a mesa que presidirão esse trabalho, além, obviamente, do nosso convidado, a presidente do Conselho de Curadores da Fundação Armando Álvares Penteado, a senhora Celita Procópio de Carvalho. Ao seu lado esquerdo, o diretor tesoureiro da Fundação Armando Álvares Penteado, Dr. Américo Fialdini Júnior. Ao lado, Dr. Américo, o diretor cultural da FAAP, o professor Vitor Mirchavka. Na outra extremidade, o presidente da diretoria executiva da FAAP, Dr. Antônio Bias Bueno Guion. E ao centro, o presidente Bill Clinton, nosso ilustre convidado, para o qual eu peço uma calorosa salva de palmas. O presidente Bill Clinton esteve 8 anos à frente da maior nação do mundo. Como nós não acreditamos em coincidências, principalmente no que se refere à história, exatamente nesse período, os Estados Unidos viveu um clima de grande prosperidade e um clima de paz. E é exatamente por isso que muitos dos biógrafos do presidente Clinton já insistem em chamá-lo do presidente da paz e da prosperidade. Sob a gestão do presidente Clinton, mais do que um crescimento econômico, um conjunto de aumento de riquezas, os Estados Unidos viveu um grande surto de desenvolvimento. Os empregos nunca foram tantos, as desigualdades sociais nunca estiveram tão pequenas. E isto se deve a este homem que é, na realidade, um dos maiores líderes mundiais. É exatamente por isso que, para nós, da FAAP, trazer uma figura deste quilate para proferir a aula magna de abertura desse semestre é realmente um motivo de muito orgulho. A expectativa que precedeu a esta palestra dá conta o quanto a comunidade esteve envolvida. Agora, na presença dos diretores da entidade mantenedora, da presidente do Conselho e do nosso ilustre convidado, nunca é demais registrar que, além das pessoas que estão aqui, neste auditório, existem aproximadamente outras 3.000 pessoas em espaços virtuais acompanhando a palestra do presidente Clinton. Para fazer a saudação oficial em nome da FAAP, eu chamo a palavra a presidente do Conselho de Curadores da FAAP, dona Celita Procópio de Carvalho.
Sua Excelência, presidente Bill Clinton. Senhor embaixador Paulo Tarso Flecha de Lima, grande amigo nosso. Autoridades presentes, diretores, professores, alunas e alunos da Fundação Armando Álvares Penteado, senhoras e senhores, é uma honra recebermos o presidente Bill Clinton, que possibilitou ao seu país e ao mundo uma época de paz e prosperidade. Sua postura em defesa do meio ambiente demonstra a todos a sua visão de estadista. Acima de qualquer decisão política e econômica, se coloca, sem sombra de dúvida, a preocupação em garantirmos um planeta saudável. Senhor presidente, sua presença entre nós é um motivo de orgulho. A FAAP tem procurado imprimir solidez à formação de nossos jovens, colocando-os em contato com a sabedoria dos mais destacados líderes políticos, empresariais e culturais da atualidade. Queridas alunas e queridos alunos, Essa lição será eternamente lembrada como uma fonte de inspiração para vocês, que amanhã serão os novos líderes mundiais. Integrando a nossa comunidade acadêmica aos acontecimentos de maior importância no cenário global, que estaremos atingindo o nosso objetivo, o de proporcionar um constante desenvolvimento pessoal e profissional aos nossos alunos. Senhor Presidente, compartilhe conosco a sua experiência. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, distinguished officials of FAAP, my old friend, Ambassador Fletcher de Lima, thank you for being here. And thank you for the wonderful welcome. I think I would be making a mistake if I did not introduce a friend of mine who came to Brazil with me, the great, now American actor, Anthony Hopkins. Thank you for coming. We're glad to see you here. Thank you. Thank you. Please stand up. Thank you. I also want to thank all the people who are within the sound of my voice but not in this room for their interests. And I am very honored to be here in this vibrant educational community, the dream of Armando Alvarez Penchado, now 50 years old, with a student body of 14,000 people. One of the things that interested me most about this institution is that it began as a school of art. And as your recent exhibition of Egyptian art from the Louvre demonstrates, you still care about that quite a lot. Pablo Picasso once said, "All children are artists. The problem is how to remain artists once they grow up." Today, in a world obsessed by economics, technology, and science, we still need the imagination and creativity of artists to make the most of this new century. Your mission, to achieve total quality based on creativity, is evidence that you understand this. Indeed, the entire nation of Brazil is a marvel of creativity in art and music and sport. I have loved Brazilian jazz since Stan Getz made it famous in the United States almost 40 years ago. My favorite contemporary singer is Virginia Rodriguez of Salvador. I knew nothing of soccer as a boy until Pelé made it a world sport. By the way, I did pick Brazil to win the World Cup last time. I'm no expert on soccer, but I know if you keep picking Brazil, you'll be right more often than you're wrong. So I wish you well in Buenos Aires, in Japan, and in Korea in the coming matches. Sometimes I think Brazilians may not appreciate that your nation has also shown great creativity in building a better society, in finding a unique way to combat AIDS, in getting poor children into school better than almost any other country at your income level in the world, and now in making efforts to close the digital divide between rich and poor. Your commitment at this institution to educating more young people will also contribute mightily to Brazil's future prosperity and quality of life. Of course, the nation faces some stiff challenges, and not all of them are of your own making. The economic slowdown in America, Europe, and Japan has taken a toll on Brazilian exports. Argentina's problems also affect you. The drought brought an energy shortage, which you have met with remarkable creativity and civic spirit. As people cut their energy use dramatically, companies rapidly develop new energy-saving appliances. All these things are good. Economically, there will always be ups and downs, but the reforms put in place under the leadership of President Cardoso will keep you moving in the right direction. the clear trend for Brazil, and I believe for all the Americas, is upward. When President Johnson visited Uruguay in 1967 for a summit of the Americas, only half the leaders there had ever faced a vote of the people. In 1994, when I welcomed the Hemisphere's leaders to Miami for the third summit of the 20th century, every leader in our hemisphere but one had been chosen by the people. Living in a hemisphere of democracies with shared values helps us to pursue common aims, including the goal we set in Miami to achieve a free trade area of the Americas by 2005, something I believe will advance peace, stability, and prosperity for all our peoples. Still, we must admit that all of us face formidable economic, social, and security challenges. Meeting them requires the creativity and imagination you advocate. But first, I think we should take a moment to define for ourselves the essential nature of the new millennium. I would like to ask you to answer this question to yourselves. If I ask you to put into one sentence, what is the dominant characteristic of this age, what would your answer be? If you're an optimistic person, you might say, well, the global economy, for more people have been lifted out of poverty in the last 20 years than at any time in history. Or you might say the information technology revolution. When I became president in 1993, there were only 50 sites on the World Wide Web. 50. When I left office, there were more than 350 million. Or you might say the stunning advances in medicine and healthcare. I was privileged to support and to be present at the conclusion of the project to sequence the human genome, which is just the beginning of a breathtaking array of medical discoveries. Or you might say the spread of democracy. Late in the 20th century, for the first time in all of human history, more than half the people on the planet lived under governments of their own choosing. On the other hand, if you were a pessimist, you might say that this is an age of great inequality, with half the world's people still living in abject poverty. Or you might talk about global warming. 8 of the 10 hottest years in all recorded history occurred in the last decade. If, in the next 50 years, the world continues to warm at the same rate, island nations in the Pacific will be flooded. In my country, the Florida Everglades, a priceless natural resource that I worked hard to save, will be flooded. Even parts of Manhattan Island will no longer be habitable. And agricultural patterns of production all over the world will be upset, creating tens of millions of food refugees. Or you might say, notwithstanding Brazil's success in dealing with it, the AIDS epidemic is the defining element of the early 20th century, with the potential to become the biggest plague since the bubonic plague destroyed 1/4 of Europe in the 14th century. 58 million people have had AIDS, 36 million still live with AIDS or the HIV virus. But unless we reverse present trends, by 2005, just 4 years away, 100 million people will have the virus. The fastest growing rates of AIDS are not in Africa, where 70% of the infected people now live. They're in the states of the former Soviet Union, on Europe's back door. The second fastest growing rates in the Caribbean, on America's back door. My wife represents New York in the United States Senate. There are 1 million people from the Dominican Republic alone in New York. It will have an enormous impact on us. The third fastest growing rates of AIDS are in India, the biggest democracy in the world with nearly 1 billion people. In Bombay alone, a city almost as large as Sao Paulo, 1/3 of the people are homeless. The AIDS epidemic could consume the community if something is not done. And just last week, the Chinese government finally admitted that they have a problem with AIDS. Perhaps their biggest problem is, according to a recent survey, only 4% of the adults in China know how AIDS is contracted or spread. Or you might say the biggest problem with the world is the combustible mixture of terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, and ancient hatreds based on racial, ethnic, tribal, and religious differences, as the current turmoil in the Middle East bears painful testament to. Now, whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, all these things have one element in common. They demonstrate, for good or ill, the growing interdependence of all the people on our small planet. So if you ask me the question, what is the defining characteristic of the new millennium? I would say that we live in an age of global interdependence. And therefore, the great question of our age, the prism through which every decision should be viewed, is whether, on balance, this interdependence will prove to be positive or negative for the vast majority of the world's people. I read a book last year which explains this, and I'm sorry I do not know whether it has been translated into Portuguese. The title of the book is Non-Zero by Robert Wright. I see a few of you nodding your heads. You know about it. The essential argument of the book is this. First, let me say, non-zero is a shorthand term from game theory. A zero-sum game is a game that in order for me to win, you have to lose. A zero-sum game is a soccer match or a basketball game or an election. A non-zero-sum game is a game that in order for me to win, you have to win too. A non-zero-sum game is a good marriage, a good friendship, a good sense of community in a university or a business, a successful peace process. The argument of the book is that from the dawn of human societies, when people first came out of caves and clans, to the present day, relationships among people have become more and more complex. And the more complex relationships become, the more we are compelled to find non-zero-sum solutions. A process and a product in which everybody winds up better off. Even in politics, there may only be one winner in an election, but the fact that elections are conducted fairly and honestly and openly is itself a non-zero-sum solution, because everyone can accept the outcome then as something that has integrity and represents their values. So, in an age of interdependence, we have to look for non-zero-sum solutions. Now, where does that leave us? Let's start with the economy and the whole process of globalization. Most places I speak, there are at least some protesters against globalization, as there were in Seattle and Naples and every other global forum. Regrettably, since I'm not president anymore and I only have words and no power, I don't draw as many protesters as I used to. But I would like to tell you where I think they're wrong and where I think they're right. I do not believe that they are right that the world's miseries are caused by economic globalization. As I said earlier, over the last 2 decades, because of increasing economic integration, more people have been lifted out of poverty than any time in history. Life expectancy in developing nations is up. Infant mortality is down. According to the United Nations Human Development Index, the gap between rich and poor has actually slightly declined since 1970. And yet, here's where I think the protesters have a point. The world is awash in problems that economic globalization alone cannot solve. For all the economic progress, half of the people in this world today live on less than $2 a day. 1 billion people, 1 in 6 people on our planet, live on less than $1 a day. 1.5 billion people never get a single glass of clean drinking water. Half the children in the poorest countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America never go to school at all. Every single minute we are here tonight, another mother will die in childbirth somewhere on earth. And this year, of all the people who will perish from heart disease and strokes and cancer and natural disasters and crime and accidents, 1 in 4 deaths will come from AIDS, TB, malaria, and infections related to diarrhea. Almost all of them are children who never had any clean water. And all these trends are likely to be aggravated by a projected population growth on our planet of 50% over the next 50 years, with the biggest increases coming in the countries that are least able to handle it. For example, population is growing 20 times faster in Jordan than Japan, 12 times faster in Yemen than the United Kingdom. Brazil has a high birth rate, but Ethiopia's birth rate is twice as high as Brazil's, with a per capita GDP 1/40 of Brazil's. Each minute I speak, another 180 babies are born, and if present trends continue, about 1/3 of them will never have enough to eat, and nearly half will never go to school. Clearly, to make the most of the 21st century, we must extend the benefits and reduce the burdens and threats of our interdependence to improve the lives of many, many more people. I believe we should concentrate on 5 great challenges, and I would like to briefly state them. First, we must do much more to promote development and economic empowerment among poor people on every continent. Trade is a part of the answer, but it is not the only answer. Debt relief for the poor nations is very important. The United States, along with our G8 partners, pioneered a new social contract for debt relief in 1999. It basically said, first to the 24 poorest nations with the biggest debt in the world, you can have your debt relieved, but you must use the savings only on education, health care, or economic development. The first round of debt relief has been completed. Uganda used its debt relief money to double primary school enrollment and reduce class size at the same time. Honduras used its debt relief money to increase its schooling from 6 years to 9 years, offered to every child. Bolivia, the poorest country in the Andes, got $77 million in debt relief and put 100% of it into child health. We should do much more of this. We also should do more to help generate internal economic development. Even the greatest trading nations generate most of their wealth by internal exchange. I think the great Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto is onto something in advocating sweeping reform of property rights so that poor people can actually prove that they own and what they live on, so that it can become a basis of credit and capital formation in the developing world. I think we should dramatically increase the number of microcredit loans given to poor people on every continent. The United States funded 2 million of those loans a year when I was president, but we should be funding 20 to 30 million a year, and if we did, after 4 or 5 years, it would have a measurable positive impact on poverty on every continent of the globe. The second thing we should do is to help people who are not part of the circle of opportunity today to build the solid health and education systems without which they can never hope to prosper. With regard to health, we should begin by having the rich countries like the United States fund Secretary General Kofi Annan's $7 to $10 billion a year for the next several years in the AIDS Trust Fund, so that more countries can follow Brazil's lead. This is very important. Recently, there was a court case in South Africa in which the drug companies settled with South Africa in order to avoid South Africa doing what Brazil has done to produce huge numbers of generic substitutes for the AIDS triple cocktail drugs, in which they committed to provide these drugs either free or at costs of somewhere between $250 to $1,000 a year a person. In America, we pay about $13,000 a year for these drugs. Now, that's all well and good, but the problem is that no other country in the world, with the possible exception of Uganda, is organized to do what Brazil did. To use medicine and prevention programs, to use government and non-governmental organizations to do what you did, which is to cut the death rate from AIDS in half in only 3 years, something for which there is no precedent on earth today. You reduced the number of people in hospitals by 80%. 6 years ago, the World Bank said that Brazil would have 1.2 million people with HIV by this year. Because of what you have done, you have less than half that number. Early this year, the New York Times said in an editorial, one major reason that only Brazil offers free triple therapy is that until now there was no Brazil to show that it is possible. Last spring, I went to Africa to speak to the African AIDS Summit to tell them that if they had the drugs today that they want, they are still not organized to do what you did, and that must be done. With regard to education, we have to do more to get more children in school. There are 100 million children in sub-Saharan Africa, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and in the poorest countries of East Asia who never go to school, and a not insignificant number in various Latin American countries. Now, we have to find ways to get them into school. Here again, I think Brazil has done a better job than any other country I know of by simply offering the mothers of the poorest children from the poorest families a cash payment if their children go to school 85% of the time every month. And the system that you have established here under the leadership of your president, which allows the mothers to go to the local lottery office and present a certification that they have done the right thing and get the money, is not bureaucratic, it's easy to administer, and it's the sort of thing that ought to be done elsewhere. In my last year as president, I got $300 million to offer a hot meal, a nutritious meal in school, either in the morning or at lunch, to children in poor countries, but only if they would come to school to get it. And believe it or not, with that $300 million, we're going to be able to feed 6 million people for a year. And they're coming to school in the countries that have gotten the money. We have to do more of that. The third thing I would like to say is that with regard to health, we have a massive water shortage in the world today. I mentioned earlier that 1.5 million people never have any clean drinking water. But we now have lands drying up all over the world that historically have been used for agricultural production. And I believe that water will be the oil of the first 3 or 4 decades of the 21st century. There are ways to conserve water more. There are ways to develop more fresh water supplies. But that will be a major part of our responsibility unless we want to exaggerate the gap between rich and poor in the world. After economic development, health, and education, the next challenge should be to close the digital divide and bring opportunities of high technology to poor people and poor places. In Brazil, you're trying to develop this folks computer initiative to offer a computer for $250 and allow poor families to buy them for as little as $10 a month and put them in all the schools. In the Indian state of Rajasthan, one of the poorest states in India, I visited a little village with a community computer where anybody could come in and get any information available to be helpful to them that the Indian government had. And there was someone there to help. All you need is a simple computer and a printer. And on the day I was there, a young mother came in with a baby about 2 weeks old. She got the health department's website and had printed out for her in simple, clear language what she should do to properly care for her baby in the first 6 months of its life. And the information was every bit as good as a wealthy American mother could get from her own doctor after a baby is born. This is just the beginning of what we could do. I have been to schools in Africa which have maps that don't have 70 countries that exist in the world today and no textbooks. I have been to chemistry labs in India which have not changed in over 50 years. But if every community had a computer with good access to the internet and a good simple printer, we could solve the textbook problem overnight. The entire Encyclopedia Britannica is on the internet now. Most of the Library of Congress is on the internet now. And we are making a terrible mistake if we don't use technology to accelerate development, education, and healthcare reforms in the poorest parts of the world. The fourth big challenge we have to confront is climate change. I explained the stakes earlier. Let me just say that the big problem today is that in many countries, I'm sad to say, including the United States, there are powerful interests who do not believe that a country can grow rich, stay rich, or get richer unless it puts more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere every single day by burning more oil and coal. Now, in the industrial era, that was in fact true. But it has not been true for some time now. It is simply not true. Look at how much you cut energy consumption here as a result of the drought-induced energy crisis. Almost overnight. You cut energy consumption by a terrific amount. I promise you, you just scratched the surface. There are presently available technologies which would allow the world to create energy through conservation at volumes that boggle the imagination. Furthermore, we are on the cusp of developing alternative technologies for producing solar energy, wind energy, hydrogen energy, and far more efficient engines in automobiles and trucks that can enable us to reverse the tide of global warming. But if we do not do it, it could undermine all the other advances that have been made by disrupting the ability of people to live where they live today and actually feed and support themselves. Today, the United States is the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. With 4% of the world's population, 21% of the world's income, we emit 25% of the greenhouse gases. And the Congress repeatedly refused in my last 3 years in office to pass my plans to do something about it. But the real price the United States may pay is that within 30 years, both India and China, at present levels of growth, will surpass us as greenhouse gas emitters, and they will never believe that they can grow wealthy without doing it if we don't set an example first. When I used to talk to the Chinese about this, I could look in their eyes and see that they thought this was some strategy to keep them poor. And why not, given the behavior of the United States? But the point I want to make is, this is the ultimate example of our interdependence. Because you get hurt just as badly as we do by our emissions. And if we don't do anything about it, we both will be hurt just as badly as the Chinese and the Indians will be by their emissions. And the world has got to get more serious about it. The Kyoto Protocol may not be perfect. It may need to be changed, but it should not be abandoned. It was a wise and good and decent and far-sighted thing to do, and we ought to stick with it. And because of all the advances that have been made, not only in Brazil, but in other countries in the Americas, I hope you will be in the forefront of pushing the world in that direction. Let me just give you one other example that you can identify with. In Brazil, a lot of the cars run on ethanol. And because of your vast agricultural potential, you can afford to do that. It's not a particularly economic thing in most of the rest of the world because it takes about 7 gallons of gasoline to make 8 gallons of ethanol. But our scientists in the United States are working on research which they believe will soon enable us to make 8 gallons of ethanol with 1 gallon of gasoline. Now just think about it. That means if you have a car which gets 60 miles to the gallon, which we'll all have within a couple of years, if it runs on ethanol and we make that breakthrough, we could be getting 500 miles to the gallon. That would take a third of this problem away. But it's a big issue. And the young people in this audience should absolutely demand at every turn that every government in the world live up to its responsibilities. We have no right to burden your children with a miserable world, and that's what it'll be like in 50 years if we don't do something about this. Finally, let me say that even if we do everything else right, the world will never be free of difficulties caused by the organized forces of destruction and genuine misunderstanding. We have to make common cause against our common security threats. When I was president, I did my best to make peace in the Balkans and Northern Ireland, in Haiti, to preserve democracies, to help resolve conflicts, to labor in the Middle East, to help Mr. Mandela and others to solve tribal conflicts in Africa, and help the Africans to do more to resist the difficulties they face themselves. I did what I could to help Colombia fight the narco-traffickers. I did what I could to help to develop defenses against biological and chemical and small-scale nuclear weapons and to defuse terrorist machinations. You may think that most of this has little to do with you, but security threats in the future will most likely not come from one country invading another, but from the invasions we will all face from terrorism, organized crime, narco-trafficking, and most of all, conflicts based on difference of race, tribe, ethnicity, and religion, all of which will be aggravated as the poor countries in the world grow younger and poorer unless we take appropriate action. Every time I see the news reports of a funeral because of a terrorist action anywhere in the world, I think of Americans who died halfway around the world when I was president. For example, you may remember a couple of years ago, 2 of our embassies in Africa were blown up. A lot of good Americans died. But more Africans died. They were completely innocent. They were bystanders. The Americans and Africans were killed in Africa by a terrorist network headed by an exile from Saudi Arabia who uses the internet to communicate with his followers, who in turn make sophisticated weapons using the latest technology. There is no place to hide from our shared security threats. And as we become more open, we'll all become more vulnerable. America and Canada have the closest bilateral big trading relationship in the world. You can go back and forth without a visa. We benefit from our openness, from our integration enormously. But as we were preparing to celebrate the new millennium, we picked up, by diligence and a little bit of luck, 2 terrorists, one in the northwest of the United States, one in the northeast, coming in from Canada, though they were not Canadians, to blow up bombs to paralyze the American people. So, what does all this amount to? All the good things and all the problems. The issue is not whether globalization is going to proceed. You can't stop it, even if you want to. We will have more globalization of travel, more globalization of information technology, more globalization of economics, more globalization of culture, and simultaneously, most societies in the world that are open will themselves become more globalized by becoming more and more diverse. The lesson of both the good and the bad things going on in the world today is that you cannot have a global economy unless you also have a global economic empowerment policy, a global healthcare policy, a global education policy, a global environmental policy, and a global security policy. And they have to be based on a vision of positive interdependence, which means simply that everyone counts, everyone has a role to play, and we'll all do better if we help each other. This can be the most exciting, prosperous time in history. The young people here in this audience will have children that, if we do it right, will be born with a life expectancy of about 90 years or more, thanks to the sequencing of the human genome. Within a few years, when you have a baby, you'll come home from the hospital, you'll have a little gene card. And it'll tell you every problem your child might have, but also what you can do to deal with it. Yeah, it'll be a little scary, but it'll also mean that more children will live longer, better lives. We are now working on nanotechnology, super micro technology, that will allow us to identify cancers when they're totally unrecognizable today, only a few cells in size. And the whole idea of incurable cancers will probably go away with adequate testing. We've already identified the genetic variances that cause Parkinson's and breast cancer. We're close to a solution on Alzheimer's. We're also going to find out what's in the deepest oceans, the deepest rivers, and the black holes in outer space. And now scientists are working on digital chips to replicate the nerve functions of severed spines, so that just as a pacemaker allows a heart to beat today, people may actually be able to get a digital chip that will allow them to get up and walk out of a wheelchair. It's going to be a very exciting time, thanks to imagination and creativity. But we have to be driven by the right dream. In the late 1960s, when this school applied to become a university, it was, in the words of one of your leaders, and I quote, "one semi-ruined building in the middle of a plot of wasteland." Look what it is today, what it has become on the strength of a dream. We can build the future of our dreams, but we have to take all the world's children along for the ride. Thank you very much. Thank you.
As pessoas que forem remeter perguntas, por favor, as nossas companheiras que estão nos auxiliando nesse processo estarão recolhendo as perguntas. E, na medida do possível, de acordo com a agenda do senhor presidente, nós responderemos ao maior volume possível de perguntas. E estas perguntas chegaram por todos os meios, já que o presidente falou da tecnologia, já que o presidente falou das possibilidades de comunicação humana, nós recebemos, nas últimas semanas, diversas perguntas dos mais variados pontos do território, perguntas de alunos usando o e-mail, e selecionamos algumas para iniciar o nosso debate. E é nesse sentido que eu inicio com uma que seguramente é uma pergunta interessante. Senhor presidente, a pergunta é do presidente da Associação dos Antigos Alunos da FAAP, Rafael Possic, e a pergunta é a seguinte: a Constituição americana é conhecida por privilegiar e respeitar o direito do cidadão. O senhor teve 2 mandatos muito bem-sucedidos e agora, de acordo com sua Constituição, não poderia se candidatar novamente. Como o senhor vê esta questão da inelegibilidade? É para começar quente o debate, né?
Well, in our whole history, there was a great tradition of presidents only serving 2 terms. Our first president, George Washington, only served 2 terms. And he left in part because he wanted to demonstrate that America would never have a king, that no person is indispensable. The only person who ever served more than 2 terms was President Franklin Roosevelt, and that was because of the combination of Depression and the beginning of World War II. Then he died shortly after he was elected to a 4th term. So the Congress then sent out to the American people a constitutional amendment to limit the president to 2 terms for a lifetime, and it passed. So what the law requires now has been pretty much the principle, operating principle of America from the beginning. And on balance, I support it. I think it's probably a good thing we had it, because I would like to have been president forever. I love the job. I loved it. I love the work, and it's all I miss today. I didn't mind leaving the White House and leaving the Air Force One and all that. You know, it was no person should ever feel entitled to such things. But I love the job. I like the work. I like dealing with these issues we talked about tonight. If there ever were to be a change in the Constitution, maybe someday they will decide, because we're all living longer and staying active longer, that maybe the limit should be 2 consecutive terms, and then if you lay out for a while, you could run again. But I would be surprised if it's ever changed at all, because as you've probably noticed, there's no shortage of people in America who would like to be president. And all of them would be very much against changing the Constitution.
Senhor presidente, uma pergunta do aluno Eduardo Keating. De acordo com a notícia veiculada na primeira página de um dos maiores jornais do Brasil, a Folha de São Paulo, nesta edição de domingo, abre aspas, ricos arrastam o mundo à recessão. Ou seja, a estagnação das 3 maiores economias do planeta, Estados Unidos, Europa e Japão, estariam arrastando o mundo à recessão. O mesmo jornal ressalta que, em seu governo, a economia americana chegou a crescer até 8%, possibilitando a prosperidade, e que, nesse momento, esta mesma economia teve um incremento de apenas 0,7%. A pergunta, então, é: o senhor, que teve um governo tão próspero economicamente, que medidas adotaria ou que propostas teria hoje para reverter esta situação?
The question is, what proposals would I have to reverse the low growth in the United States and Europe and Japan? Let me take them in reverse order. The Japanese have, in essence, had no growth for a decade because there was a real estate speculative boom and a bust, which wrecked a lot of the financial institutions, and the scale of loss was so great they were very slow in cleaning it up. And because there are a lot of internal inefficiencies in the Japanese economy. But it's a very great country with an enormous savings rate, an enormously educated and skilled population, and they work like crazy. They're very hard workers. They now have a prime minister in Mr. Koizumi who is committed, I think, to the kind of structural reform that will be necessary to restore growth. So the answer for Japan is to enact Mr. Koizumi's reforms. Now, that will make the private sector more flexible, more growth-oriented, but it will also lead to some more social instability in Japan. In Japan, big companies were like governments in other countries. They provided the social stability and security. So when that happens, the government will have to do more in Japan than it has been doing because unemployment will go up, earlier retirements will go up, there will be more things they'll have to deal with. But they can restore growth there because they have great resources and they've been a long time without it. In Europe, I think that the constant problem is to have the Europeans do more trading, not only within and among themselves, but with the rest of the world, open their markets, and keep interest rates low enough to promote growth. Generally, the central banks have been somewhat more conservative in Europe than ours in the United States out of worries about inflation because of bad memories of the past. It's not really a problem for Europe today, and they need to be more aggressive in promoting growth, I think. In the United States, we did have some periods where growth nearly hit 8%, and we averaged between 4 and 5% in my 8 years. And that's quite a lot. But we have had the longest economic expansion in American history now. And so some of this slowdown in America was more or less inevitable. We also had very highly valued stocks and technology stocks, and some of their reduction was more or less inevitable. However, I think the most important thing that can be done at home is any kind of step that will restore confidence in the future of the American economy. I think that we should continue to pay down the debt. We should practice fiscal responsibility. We should keep our markets open and be competitive. We need to, if we do that, we can keep interest rates low, we can make capital available, and then what you're seeing now will just sort of be a breather, kind of a momentary slowdown, and then we'll see growth generated again. The only way this will be a sustained recession in the United States, in my opinion, is if the investor community believes that things are not going to get better and that we're lapsing into irresponsibility and confidence is not restored. Because 30% of our growth is driven by high technology stocks. And high-tech equipment generally has driven a big increase in productivity in America. So the slowdown right now is not a cause for worry. What would be a cause for worry is if we don't pick up again fairly soon. And that's what you should be looking for. But there was no way we could avoid having a little bit of a slowdown after the long boom we've been through. It's the longest economic expansion in history. But I think it's a grave mistake if we change our economic policies, forget about fiscal responsibility, and make ourselves less able to have long-term, stable, low interest rates. That's what drives the investor decisions, and that's what drives the American economy. So I hope that that policy will be restored.
Agora, uma de caráter mais pessoal. Qual a melhor e a pior coisa em ser presidente de uma nação com tamanha importância e influência para o resto do mundo?
Well, the best thing is when you use the power of the presidency to make your own people's lives better or help other people. You know, I think we saved a lot of lives in Kosovo and Bosnia. When we opened our markets to Africa and the Caribbean, some of the poorest countries in the world, some African countries increased their American exports by 1,000% in 5 months. It changed lives, changed people's lives. And so the best thing about the job is when you save lives or improve lives. The worst thing about the job is when people die because of decisions you've made. 18 American soldiers died in Somalia in one of the worst days of my life. Those young Navy people were killed in the sunken ship in the Gulf of Yemen. The people killed in the African embassy. 19 American airmen blown up in Saudi Arabia. When people die and they're under your command, it's awful. And when you try and you fail, it's awful. I have a nightmare every time I turn on the news and I see the continuing intifada and all the violence in Israel, all the Palestinians dying, the Israelis dying, the political policy of assassination, the Israeli children blown up at the discotheque and the pizza parlor, the sufferings of both sides. We were so close to a peace agreement in January, which would have averted all of that in a way that would advance justice for the Palestinians and security for both of them. And that's an example, by the way, of interdependence. The Israelis and the Palestinians are completely interdependent. The only question is whether it's positive or negative interdependence. They share a little piece of land. They share a common history. They even have a common ancestor. So the only issue is whether it's going to work. So when you try as hard as I did and you fail and children die, it's the worst part of the job.
Uma questão de Ana Paula Fecina, da área presidente do Diretório das Artes Plásticas. O senhor sempre foi preocupado com a qualidade de vida no planeta. Inclusive, assinou o Tratado de Quioto. Em sua exposição, o senhor já pontuou a importância do Tratado de Quioto, mas deu a entender que poderiam ser feitas algumas revisões ou algumas adaptações. Se fosse possível, gostaríamos de que o senhor explorasse estas adaptações.
Well, I doubt if, when President Bush said that he was going to withdraw from the Kyoto Treaty, he said he wasn't sure global warming was real and he wanted the National Academy of Sciences to look at it. Most other people were already sure, and now they looked at it and said it's real. He also said that we couldn't meet the timetables, which is probably true now, but the reason we can't meet the timetables is because the energy interest and the members of the Republican Party who believe global warming was some phony threat to America's economic dominance kept any positive action from being taken in the Congress for 3 years. So if we can't meet the timetables, maybe we need to change the timetables, but that's better than withdrawing and walking away. The American energy companies need to step forward on this the way John Brown of British Petroleum has done. Here's a guy running an oil company that's he makes a lot of money out of greenhouse gas emissions, and he said, it's a terrible threat to the world, and we all have to change, and I'm going to do my part. And that's the position that every oil company executive, every coal company executive, in the world ought to take. And if they don't take it, then the governments ought to override their concerns and go on and do it anyway. Look, I'll say again, this is not about people being poor. There's a $1 trillion untapped market today for energy conservation and alternative energy technologies and products. I'll just give you one book if you're really interested in this. It's a book by a man named Amory Lovins and his wife Hunter and another entrepreneur named Paul Hawken called Natural Capitalism, which documents, and for what for most of you will be mind-numbing detail, all the presently available options to generate wealth out of energy conservation and alternative energy. I visited Mr. Lovins in his Aspen, Colorado office the other day, and he told me he'd had a zero energy bill, electric bill, for the last 3 months, which is, you know, pretty hot in America, because of his use of solar power and conservation.
Qual foi a principal razão da interferência na guerra de Kosovo? O senhor acredita ter obtido resultados satisfatórios?
The major reason that I intervened in Kosovo with my NATO allies is that Mr. Milosevic, who had already butchered 250,000 people with his ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and created 2.5 million refugees, was about to kill tens of thousands of more, and he did create 1 million refugees. And I did not believe that we could afford to have a tyrant in the heart of Europe, in southeastern Europe, promoting ethnic cleansing, and have Europe, the United States, and NATO be able to look at themselves in the mirror in the morning. It's not the kind of world I want to live in. And I didn't believe Europe could have the future it wanted. And I didn't believe most Serbs wanted to do that. And so I believe I did the right thing in Kosovo. Now, has it had the desired result? Not yet. Because of ethnic tensions and poverty. Keep in mind, southeastern Europe is the poorest part of Europe. And Kosovo, Albania, and Macedonia are the poorest parts of southeastern Europe. So there are going to be a lot of difficulties. We now have a big obligation to fully fund the Balkan Stability Pact, which is mostly funded by the European Union, but the United States has got to make a contribution too. We have to support what NATO is doing now, going in and collecting all these weapons in Macedonia to stabilize Macedonia. It's a country that's basically divided 2-to-1 along ethnic lines, with 2/3 being Macedonians, Orthodox Christians, and a third being Albanian. And it is a difficult time for them. And they were very responsible during the Kosovo conflict and taking in a lot of refugees, knowing it would be more difficult for them. So I support what NATO is doing there, and I think that we have to keep down ethnic cleansing and killing as much as possible. And then we've got to put some money in there, and then Europe and the United States have to open their markets to let those people trade with us. We have to buy some things from them and get them where they can make a living. If they can't make a living, it's going to be very difficult for them to overcome their ethnic tensions. Let me just mention, it's no accident that it was easier to make progress on peace in Northern Ireland, although it's not done yet, than in the Middle East. In the Middle East, the Palestinians are younger and poorer than they were when we signed the Oslo Agreement in 1993. Northern Ireland's the fastest growing part of Great Britain, and the Irish Republic's the fastest growing country in Europe. And people are growing together and benefiting together, and the average common people in Ireland are going to be livid if the politicians let the peace process die, because they like living in peace, because they can imagine a common future. And that's what you have to create to make the sacrifice and the effort in Bosnia worth it in the long run. but I would do it again in a heartbeat. Don't forget, Milosevic drove 1 million of those people away from their homes, and I wasn't going to let it be like Bosnia, where the world waited 3 or 4 years to turn it around. And so we got them back home, and I'm glad we did. And one other thing. If the United States and Europe had not stood up to Milosevic in Bosnia and Kosovo, he would still be in power in Belgrade today. The people threw him out and elected Mr. Kostunica and gave Serbia a genuine democracy. Do we still have ethnic tensions? Do we still have problems? You bet we do. Do a lot of the Serbs think America is anti-Serbian and think I'm a pretty bad guy? Yes, they do. But we'll get through all that because it's moving in the right direction now. And it wouldn't have been if we'd let him get away with it. One other point I want to make. The Bosnian Muslims and the Kosovar Albanians, who are Muslims, deserve to have the Christian nations of Europe and the United States, predominantly Christian, show that we were not afraid to stand by our principles when Muslims were involved, just as we would be if Christians or Jews or others were involved. That's another big issue here that I think is important to reiterate.
Esta é uma pergunta da ala feminina. Qual o seu sentimento sobre a possibilidade de sua esposa Hillary ser a próxima presidente dos Estados Unidos?
Now, any answer I give to that question is wrong. For this reason, you know, my wife has just been elected to the Senate just 2 years ago. And I'm very proud of her. She's doing a wonderful job. She has introduced and passed more legislation than any first-term member of Congress, first-year member of Congress. So I'm very, very proud of her. And she is a national, even an international figure because of the work she did as First Lady in the United States and around the world. But I believe that just now her major concern must be doing a good job in the Senate for the citizens of New York and using her position in the Senate to advance the causes she believes in the United States and around the world as a senator. Now, having said that, she's the ablest person I have ever known in public life, myself included. So I think, you know, she could do anything, but right now she needs to be the best senator she can possibly be, and I think that's what she's focused on.
Uma pergunta sobre a questão do empreendedor. O senhor dirigiu uma das nações mais empreendedoras do mundo. Durante sua gestão, as taxas de crescimento demonstram o vigor da atividade empreendedora nos Estados Unidos. Que lições o senhor daria para os empreendedores brasileiros para conseguir competir na economia global?
Well, first of all, I think intelligence is equally distributed throughout the world. You have to ask you, do you believe that? I mean, I do. Therefore, by definition, if you believe that, Brazilians are just as smart as anybody. Now, some cultures are more oriented toward business than others. But what do you need to succeed as an entrepreneur? You need ideas, energy, organization, access to capital, and customers. Okay? And you need a government that is conducive to starting a business. But if you want a strong entrepreneurial culture, then people have to not only be able to start businesses, they have to face the fact that some of them will fail, and then they have to be able to pick up themselves and start again. So you know, what does Brazil have? You know, you've got super creative people with very high levels of energy. And so you have to look at all the other elements and see what has to be done. Can it be made easier to start a business? Can there be more venture capital available? In America, there's a huge venture capital industry that makes higher risk loans to start businesses that banks won't make. Are national or state rules or laws too burdensome? Could they be made less burdensome? Do you have enough customers in your community? If so, if not, how can you market to the country as a whole? Can you market beyond Brazil's borders? The other thing I would say is I think there's a great deal to be said for serious institutions which train people to be entrepreneurs. You know, the United States Army, for example, believes leaders aren't born, they're made. Some are better than others because of their natural talent, but they believe they can train people to lead. And there's a lot of evidence that in the military context, they're 100% right. And we've been working at it now for nearly 200 years. So the United States has been immensely blessed in entrepreneurial skills and achievements by institutions like the Harvard Business School and by core centers of entrepreneurship like Silicon Valley, where people can learn by doing. You have all these young people get out of university. Some of them in the real boom years didn't even finish university, that were computer wizards. They'd come to work for companies that were doing well, and then because you could get money to go with an idea, they could leave and start their own businesses. So I think in India, for example, a country which now makes half the software in the world, produces half the software in the world. Even though it's a desperately poor country, they have about 7 high-tech centers now where gifted people can go and be trained, know they'll get a job in a high-tech center, and then they can get out and start their own business. So they're feeding on each other. So, you know, I can't answer the question entirely because I don't know enough of the facts. But I think the answer to the question will present itself if you say, what are all the things it takes to be an entrepreneurial success and to have an entrepreneurially successful country? What do we have now? What do we not have now? Go get what you don't have.
Muito obrigado, senhor presidente. Nesse momento, nós estamos, lamentavelmente, para todos, ficaríamos aqui uma noite toda encerrando a participação do presidente Clinton nesta aula magna que marcou a abertura do nosso semestre letivo. Existem momentos que as palavras são poucas para definir o exato sentimento. Eu tenho certeza de todos que estão aqui. O homem que foi, durante tantos anos, o homem mais influente do mundo, nos deu hoje uma lição de competência e de humildade. Portanto, vamos agradecer a presença do presidente Clinton com uma calorosa salva de palmas, agradecendo em nome da Fundação Armando Álvares Penteado. Conforme havíamos avisado, pediríamos aos senhores que mantivessem-se sentados, para que o presidente possa fazer a saída do recinto pelo vão central do teatro. Esta foi uma noite memorável e eu, professor de 30 anos, seguramente jamais a esquecerei.